Donna Loughlin is a storyteller. She's got a great podcast, Before It Happened, where she talks to visionaries about their vision, about their success. She's lives in Silicon Valley. She has an upbringing of journalism, public relations, and technology. She loves technology. We kind of guide off in the conversation to technology and some of the things that are happening now. But at the foundation, she's a storyteller. She talks about at a young age asking a lot of questions and trying to build these stories as a journalist working for the BBC and other outlets, and how podcasting has become another outlet for journalism. But it's a great conversation about visionaries, generally in technology, but not only there, but kind of changing the future. Futurist is another term that she comes up with that I wasn't familiar with. We also talk about we got off into aviation. We have a lot of commonality there, but it's a great conversation. She talks about the traits of telling a good story, what you should look for, what should be part of a great story. It's a great conversation with Donna Loughlin. I think you're going to like it. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic, I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business? And it lasted over 25 years. Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission: how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision: growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration.
I do think that I'm really disciplined in a lot of other things. So I don't know, maybe it's just like people like to choose how they're gonna be disciplined.
I know I
Because
certainly do.
it doesn't mean like truant officer
Right.
or corporal punishment. But do you struck a chord with somebody?
Yeah, I mean, discipline means different things to different people, and I show in my video I lost a lot of weight, and people say, "How'd you do it?" And I said, "Well, it's just discipline. I committed to it, and it's just discipline." So,
Yeah, well, I think
I
discipline and commitment go together.
yeah, I think so too. I think so too. Well, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate spending some time with you. You've got
Yeah,
I
I'm
I love
excited.
your podcast. I
Oh,
absolutely
you've been
love it.
listening?
Yeah, I have.
You're one of the 5,000?
It's so interesting. So why do visionaries interest you?
Wow, I think it goes back from when I was a kid.
Mm.
I have a story with my grandmother wanted to do something really very basic, which was to have lunch after going shopping downtown.
Hmm.
And we sat at a counter because we didn't have reservations. And I had the most strategic location ever. I sat between my grandmother and this elder man. He was a businessman. He was all dressed up in a suit. And I was actually pretty shy as a child, but there was something that just kind of struck me to wanna have a conversation with him, and I asked my grandmother, "Is it okay?" I'm, like, 7 years old.
Hmm.
Can I ask the man next to me a question?" And so she gave me approval, and so I asked him, why was he so dressed up
Hmm.
and having a tuna sandwich at the counter? And he told me that he, was a businessman, and of course I said, "What kind of business?" And he shared with me, just this what he did for a living, and he was an attorney. And I kept asking him questions, and he's just trying to eat a sandwich, but I had more than one question, which just kind of validated that I was just curious about, curiosity just kind of overcame me of what he did. And he I that continue to be a thread in my life. If I would go trick or treating and knock on the door and say trick or treat, and you would open the door, and I would see a Black Forest clock or some usual, artifact or artwork, I wanted to know the story behind that. So entrepreneurs to me are very much that treasure trove of discovery of not just what they created, but why, and, like, what's behind the why, and just being able to understand, uh, what was that drive? What was that initial thought or that moment in which they said, "All the chips are already on the table?" And then to use one of your keywords, to be disciplined enough to actually make it happen and make that decision. And I think that's one of the entrepreneurial spirits is, like, you have to be extremely focused and want the eye on the prize unlike anything else, and that fascinates me.
Are entrepreneurs almost always visionaries?
Not necessarily. I've worked with both. I think there's you can be entrepreneurial in creating, a business, but not necessarily one that designs or creates the product and or service. So I see that oftentimes they can be both roles, but other times I've seen that they're a collective of group of, individuals. So, you might have 3 or 4 people that come together from an accelerator, type of scenario where they brought together because they have certain skill sets and then they create something. Some of the brightest ones that I've worked with have both capabilities, bringing both the vision of facilitating change and then the ability to actually create the product and or service that's going to lead that change. But they're not always the same person.
So would you in this kind of definition, would you say that entrepreneur is more the fiduciary or the money generating versus visionary is more vision and looking where to go? Or they where do those two meet? Because I know there's a lot of visionaries who are broke, who don't make haven't broke through yet. So what happens there?
Yeah, I have this philosophy. It's kind of an interesting one. It's ego engineering versus innovation.
Hmm.
So innovation should, if done right and executed against, an open market where there was a need to solve a problem, and this could be anything from, consumer electronics product to, a smart car or anything that might facilitate doing, augmenting our life or productivity and how we live. Oftentimes, the ego gets in the way of that, and wanting to create something that we don't really need, that's
Mm.
not meaningful, that is already at a big box store like a Best Buy or a Target, and you and I don't really need that product, but somebody is so convicted to create something because for their own personal need,
Hmm.
it doesn't serve the market. And so I think sometimes there's conflict, and I've seen that often with companies that fail is typically they fail not because the market, there wasn't a market, is because the right product for the right time and basically spending so much time in development for something the market didn't need or was already, I look at, a product like GoPro, right? So aftermarket accessories, were abundant right after GoPro came to market. But as GoPro became more sophisticated as a product and started putting more capabilities, those aftermarket products it really had a short life cycle, right?
Mm. Very interesting, and I could think of kind of some of the Microsoft products that failed, even I remember when HP brought out the first, I guess I'll call it a smartphone, but there was no cellular technology, and it was kinda neat for the techies to have, but there was no market for it, and it just died. Um, so I think th I think there's some ego involved in some of those projects.
Well, look at the cultural differences between going to a Microsoft store and going to an Apple store.
Mm.
Right? And so Microsoft was always really for business enterprise, right? Not necessarily for like I'm running Outlook and running Microsoft. I also have an Apple computer. I use them for very different functions throughout the day. But if you go to a mall and I'm in proximity here in the Silicon Valley where I have in one shopping plaza a beautiful apple. I'm gonna call it an emporium, a cultural, emporium where literally people are hanging out as if they were hanging out in a bistro in any place in the world, but having experiences, right? It's all about the experience. You go to a Microsoft store, there might be 2 people. There's no greeter, there's no door greeter,
Right.
there's the salesperson who's gonna be very zealous to sell you on, whatever, they're promoting at the time, but very different experience. And I think when it comes to innovation and technology, whether it's in agriculture or it's in transportation or it's in consumer electronics, the interaction and the experience are so important from the onset of that product and all the way down if you look at an Apple-based product to the experience of the unboxing. And I think that's one of the reasons why those unboxing type of scenarios, like the reality scenarios of a coveted new product have been so popularized because people want to be able to have that connection.
And I think that's even more important now since, you do have those Apple stores, you do have some human touch, but a lot of us are getting it through the mail or they're getting it through, other means. And so all the experience really has to be packed in opening that box, because, you spent a lot of money and it's in front of you now. And what are you going to do with it? And it's an interesting culture that's happening with those Mac stores, those I stores, I think they're called. And there's no chairs in there, right? And as soon as you go in there, there's no cash registers. It's fascinating how well that works. I'm in the Northeast in Connecticut, but I'm in New York City often, and there's the couple of stores there, and they're just always just so packed. You
I don't
talked about
necessarily get the same experience when Amazon comes knocking on my door.
not at all.
It's that Pandora's box, it's always great to receive, but it's not the same experience,
Mm-mm.
is it?
No, not at all. Not at all. Uh, so going back, you're primarily a storyteller. You talked about when you were younger and you asked all those questions. I too asked a lot of questions as a child, and you do a really good job on your podcast because you kind of come in and out of the conversation to give the listener more context. It's done very very well, and I enjoy the way uh, you kind of unravel their story. Um, How long have you been interested in storytelling? It just seems so real for you.
Yeah, so the podcast you're referring to is Before It Happened podcast, which is basically a journey, with entrepreneurs, innovators, and really futurist in a lot of ways, right? Not
Mm,
everybody is
mm.
classified as a futurist, but what fascinates me about unraveling the stories is getting to that authentic moment in which they realize that they were, with all convictions, going to proceed with something. So, if I go back to the diner conversation with the attorney, his father didn't want him to be an attorney. His father wanted him to be a doctor, and he
Hmm.
chose not to be a doctor because he wanted to be able to write books and be able to write very specific types of books. And at the time, I didn't know. I was so young, but I do remember he said that he was doing human rights, and active. This is in the 70s and doing work with more humanitarian type stuff and so obviously his conviction to pursue something that was so passionate about was not what his father wanted him to do.
Mm.
And I think that's like kind of resonates, with these kind of fearless, unstoppable personalities. And so that evolved eventually into reporting. My father and his brothers owned printing companies, and with owning printing, they also owned newspapers. And so, at a very young age, I was in the back room of the print shop, and editing and opaquing and smelling the aroma of ink, pre-digital age era. And so, by the time I was 12, I was writing for the community papers, and then that led to the high school paper, and then that led to journalism, undergraduate and communications degree, and then my professional career, which basically was reporter for BBC, Reuters and also did internships at a variety of places. And so being a reporter, it was just a no nonsense journey for me. And now I've kind of gone back to, after spending the last 20 years of bringing products to market, playing the opposite side, which is more public relations and bringing products and services and people to market. I collected like a collector crab, a bunch of amazing stories and people that haven't necessarily been my clients, and their stories just fascinate me
Hmm.
because they're stories of inspiration, they're stories of hope, they're stories of drive, and I think that at the number one thing is at the end of listening to any of the episodes, I'm hoping that somebody else will be inspired to go out and do something, facilitate change,
Hmm.
change something, lead a movement, volunteer, and or create something. And because I think the entrepreneurial spirit is one that has a lot of repetition and a lot of patterns. In fact, I'm reading a book called The Entrepreneurial Faces by John Littman, which is a fascinating book about um, all the characteristics of entrepreneurs, and there's a lot of like-minded people. But I think the one thing that I capture for each individual guest is that their own personal inertia, that thumbprint that's only unique to them, is unique to them. And getting to that, sometimes they don't even know that. And that's what I do all day long, ultimately, in my
Hmm.
career, is looking for that relevant kind of diamond in the rough opening to be able to help a company or a product be relevant, and helping the innovator or the entrepreneur discover that, because oftentimes they don't know. They're so close to it, they just don't know.
Hmm. Very interesting. I've got so many questions now of what you just said. Let's talk about your kind of journalism background and the reporting that you've done. Is podcasting the new journalism?
It's a newer medium, I think, for me personally. I chose to do a podcast. I have done radio in the past, and for me to, sit down and write a book, um, finding the not just the brain cells, but the time. We all have had, extra time this last, couple of years with COVID, but um, I have friends that have hopped on planes on a 30-hour round trip flight and come back with an entire manuscript written,
Hmm.
and I have others that have taken 5 to 6 years. So, I'm still in that discovery phase of what is that book gonna be? So, for me, the podcast was a kind of a part of that discovery phase of putting together a collection, a cornucopia of stories, and they're not all same. I have chefs, I have, scientists, artificial intelligence, transportation, agriculture, robotics, aerospace, nonprofit. I mean, they're just an array of amazing people, but they all created something that they absolutely could not do, or they didn't feel that they were on their life's mission, which, and that's the rocket, because it's literally at that moment. A lot of people want to talk about the unicorns, and the unicorn is a very popular term for a very established
Hmm.
billion-dollar evaluated company. And here in the valley, there's a lot of talk about unicorns, and I'm like, well, I like unicorns, but I want to talk about the acorn moment that became the oak tree.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I get to talk to a lot of artists myself, musicians and poets and authors, and they all talk about this kind of spark that they felt, um, and how they turn that into the book, the poem, the painting, the song, and
I
the
wish
same
I could
thing.
write songs. I love music. I wish I could write a song.
It's amazing how that process is. I just talked to Brandon Hardesty from Bumpin' Uglies, and he says the music comes first and then the lyrics. And then I talked to Wordplay TJ, and he said actually the music does come first most of the time, but other times it doesn't. And it's amazing to me that, I ask them, I say, have you ever written something in somebody else's voice? That
Mm.
once you hear it's not for you. I wonder if that happens with visionaries, with entrepreneurs. Do they ever kind of create and move something and say, I love this, but I just can't bring it to the end. I know Google, I guess, would be a good example. The two partners there decided at one point to hire a CEO, right? They hired Schmidt, I think his name is, and
Yeah, I actually had worked under Eric Schmidt 2 years ago under Sun Microsystems,
what is that son?
um,
Yeah.
when he was the CTO. Yeah, I think the making of teams is, something is that entrepreneurs can realize that you have a great idea, but in order to execute and against that vision, you need to bring in, people that are brighter and smarter in other areas of expertise, and not recognizing that can be detriment for, business.
Mm. So when you hear these stories from these visionaries, is there a spark moment that they describe where I have it now, or I see it clearly, or the vision is clear, or does it happen over a long period of time?
It's interesting 'cause, I look for commonality and threads,
Yeah.
um, and oftentimes they're so into the quest of bringing a product to market and getting the funding and keeping on track and then eventually meeting reporting to the board and meeting their numbers, that they don't see the threads. So I I'll give you an example in a a young car enthusiast, you know, pursuing his desire to become a car designer, right? And ultimately that transportation and that knowledge and excitement they had to be, work in transportation, only to get away from the family business, which was farming. Well, 30 years, maybe not 30, maybe 20 some years later, all of a sudden there's an intersection of the agriculture and transportation coming together. And the founder of the Monarch tractor, which is an autonomous electric smart tractor, had been designing transportation vehicles, not wanting anything to do with farming. He, came from a rice farming family. But all of a sudden that little grain of experience was so valuable, and that intersection in the thoughts of like, put shove behind you that you don't realize, that aha moment, this was meant to be. I just spoke to somebody today who didn't realize that, her calling was, active service, and to do something, going leaving her very illustrative broadcast, career, and ultimately felt empty, and then created a nonprofit that only brought her back to the place where she began,
Hmm.
which was, very family driven, family values, not the corporate, necessarily the corporate values and wanting to give back. And so that's a common thread, that I see as well, is that people don't realize that their journey. I always tell my interns, your first job is not your last job. Your first job is a gateway into something else, and it's how you weave them together. So, I worked in book publishing and book production and editing. Thank goodness the all the experience being in the print shop as a child, helped me get that job and have that knowledge. And but I didn't really appreciate it, and I didn't really, I didn't realize it until I was probably 10, 15 years of my career, how valuable that experience was in the back room. Being able to, smell that ink and learn to write from my uncles who were journalists, and the production process. I wanted to be a paper girl. I wanted to deliver newspapers.
Hmm.
And pre-digital age, that was the coveted job that you could have under 15. Well, I missed that because by the time I was old enough, it was like it was fading itself out. No one was having papers delivered. But I think that that's a commonality that I see, is putting together threads. Um, Sometimes you pull something out of your back pocket that you amaze yourself when you didn't realize that knowledge was just sitting there because you didn't need to tap into it. And so as it relates to the transportation expert and his farming background, when he called me to tell me his story of the company, which is now Monarch Tractor, I almost fell off my seat.
Hmm.
He was calling ultimately thinking he was going to get a referral from me because I'd worked with him on another transportation project. And I said, Wow, this is amazing. I have been waiting for this call for I don't know how many years. I got my master's thesis on the democratization of the farm workers. I'm a California girl, grew up, we live in have a very big farm belt. And so that's been sitting in my back pocket for years. It was a subject matter that nobody else was writing about, and that's why I wrote about it. But
Hmm.
finally, I actually can take all that knowledge that I accumulated and spent many scathing hours and writing finally became valuable. And so that all of a sudden that became relevant, whereas days 364 days prior to that, not relevant at all.
Hmm.
So it's that discovery stage, that I go through with founders and entrepreneurs and in other words, a company that has 20,000 customers, but they couldn't tell me what their customers were saying about them. How could you have 20,000 customers and not know what they're saying or what they think? Well, that was the first thing that I wanted to unearth, like, what are they saying? People are talking. What are they talking about?
Hmm.
And by just going through that simple, discovery process, able to come out with the pros and the cons very quickly and say, this is where we need to focus.
Very, very interesting. You also talk about your kind of six-step process to make any kind of story stand out. So are you kind of coaching these people as well?
On a daily basis with my PR agency, absolutely. That's separate really from the podcast journey. The
Mm.
podcast journey has been more of a creative outlet for me, wanting to create, um, take a lot of this knowledge that's in my back pocket and front pocket, and just find people that are changing the face of so many things. So, um, but I do, boot camp workshops and accelerators and oftentimes just within one individual company at a time versus masses. So I do the boot camp workshops for when we have multiple kind of incubator scenarios. Otherwise, it's part of the narrative exploration process that I take the clients through. But before it happened, podcast is they say it's much more of the creative process, but kind of a lot of the same questions. I spend a good hour getting to know, asking, the early years and the, pre K through 12 and before you went to college or dropped out of college or, um, you know, patented your idea and like the whole, I want to call it road trip, right? And then digging into the so what, who cares? And so they're very common kind of journalistic, approaches and then turning that into something I call it a gift, curate something that then the founder, or the visionary will say, "Wow, actually she captured something that I hadn't thought about." And I that
Mm.
typically has been the response, which is, I don't know, maybe it was many years of watching, old school journalism on TV, the Barbara Walters and Oprah interviews, type things where you just gotta go in there and dig for that. And I have a great team. I have, an amazing writer, who's worked, with the Village Voice, and he was a news reporter, and so he's kinda gotten inside my brain and knows how I think and the kinds of questions that I'll ask or not ask, and then, the production team is, just phenomenal. So, my daughter always says I'm a little extra. I became a lot more extra this year.
Is that right? Very, very interesting. And when you talk to these visionaries, do you I'm kinda gonna ask for you to speak for them, but what would you guess is their kind of percentage of science versus art in their approach?
Well, it's probably 50-50, to be honest. Some folks, give a Carlo Mondavi, interview, which
That was great.
just aired, and Carlo comes from a legendary winemaking family, but he's a super creative and insightful, uh, and passionate person, and technology and how things work, it hasn't been the forefront of his career, but because he is so conscious about the earth and sustainability, that working with the experts that he has, as part of the company team, allow him to become, much more scientific and thoughtful in that process, right? So that's an interesting and probably rare scenario. Other people like Tyler Florence, the chef who's known for his Food Network series and all his cookbooks, definitely more of the artistic approach of things,
Mm.
but he's equally passionate about technology and transportation and things that allow him to do his job better or live his life better. So I think there's a lot of adaptability on both sides, and being able to kind of use the left brain, right brain when maybe you didn't even think that you were using it.
Now, when you prepare to speak to these visionaries, how do you approach it yourself? Do you approach it more science than art? You do some research and you try to see how they operate.
You know, I I'm kind of split down the middle as well.
Mm.
Being a writer and former reporter journalist, I mean, I write every day, in my career, but I probably take a more artistic approach to how I think and how I build a story. But if it's a technology or an innovation person, I do really geek out and get into the how it works, and because I do like I was the kid that was always following, with pigtails, my father, and wanting to know, like he was whether it was, fixing a mechanical thing on a car, or if it was installing, something, new within, garage door opener, just anything basic like that. Anything that was at Tandy Radio Shack or the hardware store, um, tinkering and fixing things was just always fascinating to me. STEM education, I think, is something that we all hear a lot more, but I think that, growing up, girls weren't as at least my generation, weren't as encouraged to take the hard math. Well, I took the hard math, and sometimes I was the only girl in the math class,
Mm.
and I liked challenge and to be challenged, but I think now it's a little more of an equal fair, is that you can be good as just as good in science as in math, and oftentimes people get in the lane where they've been told to stick in one or not. And for me, being able to understand and do, the physics and the chemistry and the math was very much equal to me as me learning history and creative writing and more of the humanities, right? And so I think oftentimes we're just kind of put in these lanes by default or by stereotype, but I think that it's much more equalized. You look at programs like Girls Who Code or Black Girls Who Code or some of the STEM robotics competitions that happen, and it's so exciting. I've gone to a lot of these to seek the next generation, hopefully going to be seeking jobs in STEM and, technical math, science positions. Um, I kind of feel like I'm in the Silicon Valley in particular, I'm a little bit of a constant science fair, and I
Hmm.
and I think that's pretty cool. And but the biggest thing that's been happening is there's been this juxtaposition and convergence of all these technologies that kind of convene together. So just think about your home, smart home. The smart home is the home with the Jetsons once, kind of visualize. But think 20 years ago, the things that we didn't have in our home. We didn't have necessarily the electric charger. We didn't necessarily have the Nest smart device. Refrigerators certainly weren't talking to us. Well, maybe they were talking to us, but not in the electronic way. Come hither, um, and the Roomba and all these different things that we needless to say, are tech devices or that we have. I mean, a microphone hasn't, changed. Maybe it's gotten better over the years, but if you think about you going from word processing to the smart laptop to iPads down to the micro of your phone, I mean, our expectations are pretty high. So if we think about that experience of going into the Apple or into the Microsoft store, we now can demand that. And the younger kids, that unfortunately the a mobile device has become the babysitter. my babysitter, would read, go out and we'd play,
That's
play
right.
board games and be outside and stuff. So I'm hoping that the STEM education boom isn't just a I want to say it's a trend, but it's like evergreen and stays as part of the curriculum because I do think that's the future for future innovation and creativity.
I agree. I tinkered with technology as a youth as well, teaching myself programming languages, eventually moving, to high school and college, and it was just predominantly male, unfortunately, and
I learned
these
blockchain from a 10-year-old child.
yeah, of
And,
course.
you know, 25 years in my career, so I think that's pretty funny.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the difference is incredible, and I wonder, I'm excited. I'm excited. People, career in technology, it's great because it changes every day, and it's bad because it changes every day. So you have to uh, expect it and move from it. I mean, that's why I like it so much. I
I
would
mean, you're a
imagine
technical person, how do you keep
yeah.
up on all the new fandangled, you walk through a big box store and you see the latest and greatest of everything. How do you decipher and what you need and what you don't need?
I definitely have way more than I need. That's for sure. And if I see something that I like, Bluetooth has gotten a lot better. Even charging phones and the car technology of connecting my Android to my car has come a long way. I just like the gadgets. I like we do a lot of software development in the firm, so try to stay up on that as well, which is predominantly Microsoft based. We have that stack, but keeping up on it is very tough because it's constantly changing, and you want it to change. But I imagine that's what attracted you at a young age and still now.
Yeah, well, it's just I'm kind of an old adopter though. I don't have to get the first widget and device when it first comes out. I kind of wait for the price to drop.
Mm,
And I remember when Walkmans first came out. And that was one thing that I wanted, like, because I love music and I wanted a Walkman. And when I was actually had the privilege to work on the iTunes launch
hmm,
and with the iPod and iTunes. And I just I was the only one outside some of the senior Apple staff that could relate to that Walkman experience because some of some of this they were listening to listening to music in just in different waves, right? So we go from vinyl, to 8 tracks to cassettes to,
right,
this now you can be portable and take it, in this Walkman. And then you get years later in the, footprint of digital, right? And then we have to deal with all the issues of digital rights and privacy and all those things. But that's an industry that evolved very quickly, right? And I think that's one of the things if you even look at what's happening in aerospace and the race to Mars and everything, is that aerospace and space exploration has been happening, since the 50s and in science, science fiction novels and probably talk even beyond earlier than that.
mm.
But because the pace in which the innovation and the technology and the advancements of the tools to create are so much more readily available, the acceleration just seems like, "Whoa, I thought we were just in the moon, and now we're actually going to Mars, and you're gonna be able to buy a ticket to space." I never thought I was gonna see that in my lifetime. That, to me, is pretty fascinating.
It certainly is. And as a science fiction fan, watching, Star Trek and Lost in Space and Space 99, all these, it's amazing to me that none of them predicted the World Wide Web.
Do I remember the World Wide Web the well, I can't even say that. The World Wide Web, Al Gore invented it, didn't he?
Yeah, sure did. Super
Um
Information Highway.
Needing to purchase space on a web page
Right.
because you there wasn't enough people that developers to create the websites. So literally you go to a hosting provider and then you would buy space. And this is before the mega surfing, service providers were around, but there was a race for that, right? But one
Digital
couldn't
real estate.
yeah, and one couldn't just create a website. The
Right,
WordPress didn't exist. And
right.
so those certain the scarcity and skills, right? And I remember sitting in a board meeting at one of a company that I was working where and one of the investors came in and we had bids for a website build and one of them was as high as a half a million dollars. And this was in 1996. Half million dollars to create a website, and this wasn't a fancy e-commerce back in,
Right.
a website. This was for a company that was actually in the internet service provider space themselves that needed to have a service-based page. But prior to that, the Yellow Pages were obviously being obsolete, and Yahoo and the wars with the internet service, the search was big, so you had Yahoo and Lycos and all these other services that were scrambling for that mind share. And if you look at the how fast the internet boom happened into where we are, I mean, it's just that just seems like the dark ages in comparison.
Absolutely. I mean, if you asked 5 or 6 years ago, any office, what would you rather, not live with for a day? What could you be out with? The phones or the internet? I mean, it's a no now it's a no-brainer. I mean, you can still talk, you back then, the internet used to go out and sometimes come back in, but now it's the lifeblood of any organization and consumer. Out of all the
I can't live
go
without my dog in my office now, though.
Aw, and your turtle?
And the turtle, yeah,
Yes,
lucky lady,
lucky.
found a toy box, size of a silver dollar is now the size of a pineapple.
Wow. Out of all I remember watching Star Trek as a kid and thinking, "Okay, what technology can't I wait for?" Transporting from one location to another, hundreds of people in a ship,
Bubba Fett.
s well, yeah, that's Star Wars, yeah. So surgery, like, outside of the skin, but it's amazing, the first thing that came without a problem, which I never thought of, was talking to a computer and having it respond. We've had those for 5, 6 years that work quite well now. Amazon has a prominent one, Google, Apple, everybody's got one. So that was the first one to arise.
Yeah, I was fascinated the first time I could take a photo from my phone. I will say
Mm,
that was a little bit of a magic for me because I love photography and capturing, documenting things. It was a horrible quality compared
right.
to what we have now. But I was so excited that recently on before it happened, I interviewed Steve Sasson, who is the inventor of digital camera,
Hmm.
and really got to find out what that was like. It was kind of a happy accident. Like he didn't set out to create a digital camera, but that was fascinating because now we just expect it.
We certainly do. And some of the cameras can take pictures of the moon. I mean, the strength of these cameras. I remember hearing once that Apple has over 200 people just working on the lens,
Wow.
of the iPhone. I mean, yeah, there's more technology in this little square than was ever on the moon landing in the, late 60s. I mean, yeah, it's, the amount of technology and they're just as costly as a laptop, right? And the high-end ones. But yeah, the technology is there and it excites me. Many it intimidates and almost threatens. I don't see that at all.
What do you consider to be your most trusted, um, advanced device that you couldn't live without?
Well, I mean, it would have to be a tie between, um, my cell phone and my laptop. I mean, everything else, I mean, I use a GPS for golf. I use Peloton to ride. I mean, but that's all. It'd probably be a tie between those 2. How about yourself, Donna?
Absolutely has to be my phone,
Yeah.
and I would say I'm tethered to it. I have times where I know to shut it turn it off, and to connect with my garden or connect with
Mm.
some form of outside activity, that's not digital. But, you know, phone is a communications device, so clearly I use it, all the time through work. It certainly makes it rain, brings me money, but it connects me with even better more conversations and people. And having, in particular, in during the pandemic when we can't have those real in person conversations, I think the phone has become, I'm gonna say the lifeline, but that connectivity line, it's like the party line that you once have. And there's some really cool apps that you can use that you can bring in, multiple people that are outside video conferencing, for those conversations and keeping, people in touch around the world. Because I have people I stay in touch with around the world. But yeah, I think the phone would be the one thing I could give it up. In fact, I have, for maybe 7 days,
Wow.
I gave up my car in 2021. I didn't
Really?
use my car I didn't drive anywhere for almost 4 months. If I couldn't walk to the store, which in my neighborhood is a great Italian gourmet grocery store, or
Fantastic.
to the Ace Hardware, or anywhere to my downtown area, small downtown, which is like a 1.5 miles to, so 3 miles round trip. I didn't need it. Anything
Hmm,
else you can get on Amazon if you really need it. But I just figured I don't need to. I wasn't commuting to my office. I wasn't commuting to client meetings.
right.
And I did, on occasion, take my car to go get it washed because I also didn't want a dirty car. But I felt that it wasn't I'm going to reduce my carbon footprint. I just really had no need. And that actually felt kind of good for a
Hmm,
change.
hmm.
That I wasn't stuck in traffic. I wasn't rushing between, point A to B. And then I had one cathartic moment, I think maybe about 9 months into it, that I told my daughter, I said, "We need to get in the car and we're gonna go for a ride." 'Cause the joy of just being able to go for a road trip, was kinda out of
Mm,
the conversation. And we drove to a small coastal town called Half Moon Bay, which is in the Pacific and north of, Palo Alto and south of San Francisco, for those who don't know the area. 35 miles south of San Francisco, I guess. Kinda smack in the middle of where I live. I just wanted to see the ocean. I
hmm.
just wanted to see if it was still there. And of course, when we got there, we couldn't park because you're not allowed to park and want anyone gawking at the ocean. But it just felt good to know that you can make that connection with the ocean. It was still there. And I think that ultimately that's what people are really looking to do with technologies and things like the smartphones, is to use it as a means of communication and connection, not meant to be a tool of weaponry or, big debates or, app mania and having, apps that don't necessarily have a consciousness. And I think that being selective of what kids are looking at and
Mm.
viewing has become more an important conversation that I've heard from various friends and employees, is that I think people are just being more selective how we use the phone.
I think that's important because
And
you
I did take
can.
a picture of the ocean.
Nice. Were you able to touch it?
No, we're not allowed to go. We weren't allowed to go to the beach.
At all. Why not?
They were closed in California.
Ah, all beaches.
All beaches on the coast were closed, and it was being reinforced by the highway patrol and the
I don't
sheriffs.
understand. Why?
There's someone people we were told people were supposed to be shelter in place,
Oh.
and if you were, it wasn't that it was an issue driving, and that freedom of driving and doing a road trip, but they just don't want you lurking around and hanging out. You technically were supposed to be home. So we moved beyond that, thankfully.
Yeah, of course, of course. So before it happened, your podcast where you talk to visionaries, and really the theme is more of, before, if you can explain the why the title, and I want to also talk about discipline.
Yeah. Well, the whole show has been an act of discipline.
Mm,
So, Before It Happened is a podcast that's designed to showcase the visionaries and the future they imagine. So whether it be somebody who visualizes, cleaner farming or um, better practices in cybersecurity, or uh, could be, an invention that was already I'm so excited. In a few weeks, I have the woman who actually in who created and patented the sports bra. You might think,
Hmm.
"Well, what is a sports bra and a tractor and a high performance car and a camera have anything to do with it?" Well, they're all people who have actually changed something, disrupting the commonplace and facilitating change, and oftentimes creating an entirely new market. So Al Alcorn, creator of Pong, created an entire gaming industry. That just kind of it blows my mind.
Yeah.
Younger generation that grew up on gaming, they don't know necessarily know Pong or all the nuances that led to that. But we can't forget, it's the same way people, are so dialed into and know, like, E equals MC squared equals Einstein. Some of these stories are going to be, like, archived at some point, and there's gonna be another advancement and another advancement. Um, the transformation, of the mobility on 2 wheels and the Damon, Motors in out of Vancouver vision and the execution, 40,000,000 in pre-orders,
Hmm.
and a motorcycle that is not to market yet. What is in that magnitude of that vision
Wow.
and creating a not just a motorcycle, but it's really a story about change and creating a movement. And so that's commonplace in every single one of these types of stories. And so that's the common thread I see in all of them is the magic and saying the impossible is possible, and watch me. Right? And so that's what I get so inspired by, um, my guest. I do a lot of research in advance, and sometimes I bring up things that they're kind of surprised that I dug up, unearthed. Um, this week, I'm interviewing the 2 lads, 2 British, a very, accomplished actor and music producer. And they created a podcast that basically is the new platform for communication. It's not the barbershop anymore. It's not where my dad would go hang out with
Hmm.
his peers and chat about life, but opening using the podcast as a means to talk about real world things, depression, anxiety, addiction, discipline, all the things that love, that often you don't hear men talk about. And so I'm like, what's their story? Like, why would they do this? And so what's innovative about it is their approach to, talking and the format and the setting in which they created that. They have 10,000,000 followers. Actually, that's wrong. It's 11 over 11,000,000 this week following them.
Wow.
So they're clearly creating a movement, and they just started. I call it a little bit of the British, like, 3rd wave. So we had the Beatles, and then we had the new wave, and now we got this 3.0, and
Hmm.
these guys are leading this really really, I think the market, and the way people have been looking at life in general, they saw a need and a niche, and they ran for it. And
Hmm.
so I'm just digging into that story this week. And that's really different from talking to, somebody who created a platform or innovation. Innovative? Absolutely. Entrepreneurial? Absolutely.
Would you consider these visionaries disciplined, and would they consider themselves that?
I don't think they realize that they are, how
Mm.
disciplined they are, but it's definitely a trait, right? And I think one of the key things about, to me, discipline and motivation are 2 words that are just kind of, they stick together. I have a vision board, and I will say, focusing and kind of manifesting what it is that you want to happen, and looking at something on a regular basis. I don't look at it every day, but sometimes I look at it and I'm like, oh, that just happened, and this just happened, and this just happened, and I think that that visual, perception and quest is something that is very common in discipline. Like you talk about, your own discipline, and I think what's really inspiring about that is that it has to be in your mindset.
Mm.
And I'm a very cerebral person to begin with, and if it's not in my mind, and I can turn it off or on, but I have to visualize things and very, very pictorial before I can do something. So with a podcast, I listen to several hundred podcasts. I know the ones that I religiously listen to on if it is a podcasting is a religion, I'm not sure, but
Mm.
that I listen to on a regular basis. And I was listening for quality, I was listening for content, I was listening for style, I was looking at the artwork, I was listening to the guest, I was looking for patterns, and I created a massive spreadsheet in my research before I set out. I had a totally different name, and I was looking for how to construct it. I knew that I couldn't do the DIY. I had a bunch of other DIY projects going on, so how was I gonna take on another? And so, when I finally found the right team to work with, and I know some people chuckle and say, "You don't need a team, you just do it off your living room couch." I go, "No," but I had a different approach. I wanted to bring the narration, I wanted to do the more of the
Mm.
storytelling component, layering over, which was gonna require a team.
And it's well worth it. It's really, really good. I really enjoy it, and it's addictive. You do a really good job of bringing them out a bit and kind of filling the whole picture. Um,
When somebody asked me if it was before IT happened, and I thought, "Wow," it's the it
mm,
part is so important. It's the it, that moment, that time when it happened and that pivot. But I thought, "Wow, could we do a whole show?" Joey, maybe you can do this one on before IT happened, because then we could talk about all the disparate non-network devices, and we could talk about, pre-internet and all these, and they're going, "I don't know." I asked my IT guy, I said, would you listen to a show? And he goes, "No, I'm already in it. I
mm.
couldn't listen to it."
Yeah, I can't. It's so hard to relate. There's just so many things that we just take for granted now. I mean, even podcasting. I mean, there's so many platforms available. There's recording platforms. There's directories. There's distribution.
Do you
There's.
listen to a variety of podcasts
I
depending on
do.
your mood and what you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I have about 5 or 6 mainstays, and then I kinda widen up, and fortunately, I get to talk to a lot of the people that I listen to podcasts to, so it shines a heavier light on it, but,
What are your
I
top
mean.
3? What are the ones that you, besides mine,
Yeah.
and you're on my list, but what are the ones that you're kinda like your staples that you.
Well, it depends, like, it depends what kind of mood I'm in. If I wanna laugh, like today, I heard the new Smartless, the 3
Mm.
actors there, they it's funnier when they kind of bust each other, than the guest, so I felt like laughing and loosening up a little bit. When I wanna have more of, I listen to a decent amount of sports, and I'm a big soccer fan, so there's those there,
Do you
and
coach?
I used to soccer?
Or soccer, golf? I know you do lots of different sports.
Yeah, I used to coach my daughters, but they're off to university now, so I don't anymore. I used to though. Yeah. Did you ever do any coaching?
I was an avid cyclist, road racing and track
Oh.
racing up until my early 30s, and then because of a career, just kinda packed it in, but no, I never coached. I was more of a, um, not a team sports, but, my daughter was a competitive tennis player and my son was in gymnastics, so I was around a lot of that, but that's a gift to be able to coach.
Yeah, I enjoy it. You're able to kind of, shed your light on it. What are your top podcasts?
I love Guy Raz and How I Built This and
Mm.
NPR. He does the unicorns, I do the acorns, I like to say.
Mm.
But he has a very, the journalistic traditional journalistic style, which I personally really appreciate. Um, I listen to, oh my gosh, Lex Friedman, which is, he's a neuroscientist, but I
One of mine.
kinda geek out. He's a little mesmerizing, when I first
Yes.
listened to him, my kids are from Russia, my daughter and I were listening, and I said, he's kind of he's sucking us in here. He's
Yeah, he
pulling
does.
us in, the
He does.
gravity." But I really respect, him and his knowledge and the guests that he has, and I that obviously is not something that I'm gonna be walking the dog with. It takes a
Right,
little more of a
right,
deeper,
right.
like, I'm gonna just literally take a couple of hours of
Mm.
quiet time and use it almost like meditation. And, I listen to a lot of other just, like the Jordan Harbinger show and Dave Asprey, who I'd actually worked with in tech industry for a long time. It's very interesting. Um, and then obviously the two lads that I mentioned, because I want to know how a man thinks. So, but those are the ones that Wired actually has some great content, and
Mhm.
then I listen to Masters of Change, but a lot of other like entrepreneurship, type of motivation
Huberman
topic.
Labs. I don't know if you
Oh,
ever
he's great. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
he's great.
Yeah, no, I like the fact that I feel like I'm in a master's class with him.
Mm, mm.
Like I'm auditing a class that I probably would fail if I got a letter grade, but he has a such an intimate way of breaking things down that you go, I got it. I am smart enough to grasp this, right? And particularly when on Instagram he does a lot of drawings and illustration
Yes.
of what he's talking about. Yeah, and very natural.
Very natural. When he's live, he's the same as when he's recording, and, he comes on some other shows as well, and I've learned a lot from him. Meditation, just stretching, intermittent fasting, there is just, yeah, it's podcasting has brought a lot of positivity to my life, certainly, and, I mean, I started mine only because my friends kinda said, "You gotta do this, you gotta do this, you gotta do this." I turned 53, I'm empty nest, so I kinda,
Oh yeah, the
gravitated
kids
to
are
it.
in college now, so you have a little
Yeah,
extra
a
time.
little extra time, yeah, yeah, so that's why I decided what put you over the edge to do the podcast?
Well, it'd been on my vision board for about 3 years.
Ah,
And a vision board, podcast/book, and when COVID, I just had extra time to really start thinking about it and making it happen because like anything, like I originally started out, I was just gonna be a consultant, and then I actually created an agency, and so if I'm gonna create a podcast, then how am I going to, manage that amidst everything else? So, I have I have a vision, I have goals and, 1 year, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, big leapfrog, 5 years, where's it going? And for me, it's a creative outlet because we were talking about the storytelling, kind of process. And what I do day in and day out is the working with companies in the discovery process. And subject matter is often technology, so artificial intelligence and robotics and transportation and aviation and, all those things, and then a lot of cause-driven things such as sustainability and climate change and consciousness and all that's great, and I love it, but being able to branch out and have access and conversations with people that don't necessarily fall in those buckets,
mm,
and so you talk about the left brain and the right brain and science versus art. I think I've been able to kind of pull in, a lot more kind of the artistic thinking individuals, into the
mm,
conversation because in the Silicon Valley, particularly where I live in the which elasticizes basically around the world because I work with so many different companies that want the Silicon Valley Midas touch, but they live in another country. Um, Oftentimes those artistic folks get overshadowed big time.
hmm,
And so, I talked about, being relevant and constantly looking at things. There's a reason why a photographer shoots multiple times a day. You photograph something in the morning, it's going to have different light and shadows than in the afternoon or in the evening, right? And then it's just like, well, the area of like, okay, so I got to stay relevant. How do I actually maintain, being relevant? How do I remain bold and fearless? Kind of keeping that entrepreneurial spirit and creativity, drive. And then you gotta listen to the market, it's like old I say
Mm.
I'm a late adopter, but the reason why I typically am is because if I go to a computer electronics show at CES and coming up again this year,
Oof.
everything that's also in a showcase for the future, and then it's like it's super expensive, right? I don't know if you remember the first time you had a Blu-ray, before
Hmm.
that, was the video recording stuff. All that stuff was expensive when it first came out. TV was expensive when it first came out.
Yes.
Now
Yes.
you can actually go to Target and you could probably buy a TV, um, a flat screen for, $50. I mean, it
Right.
amazes me how cheap you can get things. But you have to listen to the market, and then you also need to be agile. And I think that's one of the things that, podcast allow it would regardless of the subject matter, we're highly mobile. Hopefully you're thinking, you have a conscience and you are more than a pulse to listen to not just listen to knowledge and content and kind of decipher what you need. But I think the platform of a podcast is great because whether you're driving, you're at the gym, you're walking the dog, you're on a plane, you're in between classes at school, podcasts are really good companions, right? And knowledge and content is king. So finding the podcast, I think it's like, finding a pair of shoes. You got to find the ones that fit for you. And there are some podcasts that are extremely popular, and I
Mm.
listen to them and going, I don't know why this is so popular. I don't
I
think I'm
agree.
the audience.
Me
I
too.
really don't think I'm the audience. So it's
Mm.
you have to find the ones that work for you.
And the good news is that there's millions of them, so you can
A lot of
yeah.
yeah, and that's another that's like, "Joey, like, why would we even wanna do a podcast?" Well, do you know, there are a lot of people, you get the bolts of the world that can, run faster than a cheetah and a gazelle combined, and then you get people who jog. And I think for creating a podcast, I did get a lot of that, like, "Oh, you're gonna be another one of these podcasters, another one." And I said, "Well, I'm actually very confident that in 2 years' time, I look back at my podcast and the guest and the stories that are unweaving and being told. I think I still chuckle already about my first podcast interview and how much we all kinda learned about each other as a team, how much we learned about content. I'm already going back in and changing my intros.
Hmm.
Although I like them, our guests have expanded and last eyes a little bit more, and so I need to make sure that intro matches that. I also
Hmm.
have a list of 50 some people that are in the queue to be interviewed, and each one of them are different in their own right. And sometimes we decide, well, okay, who goes next, and which one do I pull up, and which one do I
Mm.
push out, and now people are emailing and, filling out the form on the site and saying, "Hey, you know, I'd like to be on your show." Um, and then, connecting with people like you or creating something new. And your approach to your podcast is slightly different than mine, but yet we're very complimentary, right?
Right.
So we're a little bit of a tribe now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sensing that. I'm definitely sensing that. It is a bit of a tribe and, all welcoming, by the way. I think I mentioned in the beginning, just I've had a little bit of pushback from some of the, potential guests that discipline
On
isn't one of their
discipline, they don't like the word discipline.
yeah, just a little bit. Some of them said, "I don't like discipline. I'm not a disciplinarian, and I'm more compassionate." And it's interesting. One of them, I kind of said, "Well, I would like to debate this," and they agreed. So we're going to talk. But the rest of them have been like, "I know I don't want any part of this. Your audience just wants to hear about discipline." And I guess it's a theme, but it's really I'm more interested in the stories. I'm more interested in conversation. I'm more interested in learning, and the experience just kind of bring in discipline a bit. But we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about Um, it's been written by many people, but I think he popularized it and made it. Tim Ferriss, talks often about, the importance of, making your bed. My mother told me that lesson. I didn't need to wait to hear it from Tim Ferriss, but I actually the type of person I will not leave my house if my bed's not made. And
Hmm.
I feel, and it's supposed to be that sense of accomplishment, right? You made your bed, then you achieved one task, check it off your list, complete. I just like coming home to a really freshly named bed. I didn't think it was a really psychological reason why, but I guess there is. But for me, making the bed, I take my sleep very, very religiously. I love sleep. I think that it's something that, I know for me personally in disciplining and making sure that I have a fresh mind and
Hmm.
your mind and your body are rested. And you have to protect your calendar sometimes and tell people no. And no is harder to say
Hmm.
than yes, right? And being able to discipline yourself in a routine. I will be the first to I just joined an Orange Theory, class on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and that's something that I haven't had in my schedule because the gyms my gyms were closed, and so I'm like, "Okay, so I have a regiment." I don't know, the word regiment sounds kind of even more fierce than discipline,
Mm, mm.
but I like routine and regiment. I like structure. Um would I be a great private Benjamin? Absolutely not. But but I think discipline, like, in my career, if I hadn't been disciplined in choosing the right jobs and making the right moves, and then making the leap of faith to create my business and to be disciplined knowing that I'm not a funded company, I'm a cash-based business. I didn't get venture funding like a lot of my clients. So that took a lot of discipline to build infrastructure and put structures in place and attract the right clients and the right team and those components, right? And I think if you look at what's happening with a lot of unfortunate cause and effect of restaurants and service businesses during COVID have been impacted. My business has actually been booming, and I think it's because the creativity and the entrepreneurship is increased even more,
Hmm.
and companies are producing and bringing products to market faster. So that discipline that I've had in my business and quality of service in terms of engagement and output for my clients is no happy accident. You have to be extremely disciplined to have that quality, right? And and 20 I just celebrated 20 years with my agency,
Hmm.
and I kinda look back and go, "Wow, that went by really fast."
Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, the first 5 I remember going, "Oh, this is awesome, I did it." 10 anniversary, I remember going, "Okay, I got this. Now what can I do?" And at the 20-year hallmark, I should be like, "Oh, somebody wanna take it over?" But I'm actually probably more deeply engaged and more hands-on than ever, only just because I feel, very grateful that I've been able to create a career that I thrive in and that is constantly changing and challenging me. Do you know what I took up during to complete in this last 2 years? That
No.
required more discipline than anything that I've done in the last 10 years to get my pilot certificate. So
So you got your VFR?
I do, and my instrument rating in the process.
Wow.
So my father flew, and I would sit on something called the Yellow Pages,
Yes.
and was constantly at the airport and grew up around that, and I had every access to and I flew my joke is I flew illegally. I knew the ins and outs of anything you can in a Cessna, but I went off to college and didn't really pursue it and then kinda put it on hold and then picked it up again, then stopped it, and this last 2 years, I decided, "Okay, this is ridiculous. Why didn't I ever complete this?" And so it's takes a lot of considerable amount of time and discipline. It's also can be quite expensive, so you need to, create a budget and allocate the dollars where you wanna spend, but it's something you really wanna do, and it's not illegal, and it's not gonna kill you. I mean, some people might argue with me on the latter, but I'd rather fly the plane than jump out of the plane, and but that's taken me a lot of discipline, and I'm really that was a huge achievement, and I not only did it for myself, I kinda did it for my dad, it's just like, "Okay, I finally pulled this off."
Yeah, congratulations. I got my VFR visual flight rules about 6, 7 years ago, and I had a Piper Archer, so low
Oh,
wing versus
nice.
versus the high wing
So
Cessna
what
we
do you
talked
fly
about.
now?
I sold it and I haven't been on for a couple of years, unfortunately.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I
so
let
much
it.
work
Yeah, to
to
get back. Yeah, but now
yeah,
that I'm an empty nest, perhaps I'll go back.
yeah, so I my typical rides are, a Beechcraft Bonanza and
Ooh.
a Cessna 172, and I have friends who have some really lofty, beautiful jets, that I am aspiring to be able to take over
Mm.
at some point. So it's still, it's discipline to get it's like going to the gym. You gotta go to the
Sure.
airport. When you go to the airport, people don't understand. When you go to a metro airport, it's a whole outing of itself when you
It
meet
certainly is.
people and it's another tribe, right?
Yes.
Um, but I would say, great things come on planes, and so being able to zip up and down the coast and see if it's still there,
Mm.
is a lot easier than doing it in a car.
Yes. Yeah, I'm in the Northeast. I would go out to Martha's Vineyard and to Nantucket and to Block Island, quite frequently, and, yeah, it was
Nice.
fun. I miss those days. I should revisit it.
Oh,
Well,
it's a
Donna.
long, long time to do.
Yeah, I haven't gone back. Yeah, 6 years maybe, and I sold the plane and yeah. It's hard to do, the girls, I was coaching both of them. I got plenty of excuses. You don't wanna hear that. It'll take discipline to get back. I gotta prioritize it now.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, once you learn, I mean, it's just like, I mean, there's so much detail in learning to fly. Uh, I talk to pilots that are, want to quickly just move to all the a high digital, cockpit experience. And I think that's
Mm,
great, but I do think there's nothing quite like the experience of learning to fly a traditional piston plane with all the steam dials. It's
six
actually
pack.
it's actually quite romantic.
Yeah, it
And you
is,
think
yeah.
about it, it's like, and I get in and I'm going, okay, Amelia did this, so can I.
That's right.
And and you just think of all the people that flew before us, the things that talk about innovation and user experience, all the mishaps and all the dedication and the discipline that it's taken, for aviation to advance himself, and so that people like us can do that. And I just went on my first business trip last week to Canada, and of course the plane wasn't very full, and I was able to have, get a pop in and look at the cockpit and ask a couple of questions. And so my silly question, to the pilot was, so on the 737, when you taxi out, are you having to do it all, with your feet? Because you know what I'm talking about,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he's laughed. He goes, "Oh my gosh, wouldn't that be the beast?" And I said, "Yeah, because that's a workout in its own, right? So when you're learning, you're all wobbly and wiggly, and like you hope you don't hit a plane. It's like learning to walk for the first time. But yeah, I think to me, again, going back to my childhood, going to the airport was a common place. That was a safe place. That was a place of discovery and bewilderment. And my father had friends who built planes, and they were always, flying around and
Absolutely. So those who listening, when you're taxiing, when you're not in the air and you need to, taxi the airplane, the yoke or what you would think is the steering wheel has nothing to do with that. You use your 2 feet to steer the wheels to get onto the active run space and move around. So that's what we're talking about there. We need to use our feet to actually taxi
yeah.
versus the yoke. Yeah. Donna Loughlin, absolute pleasure. Really thank you for your time today. The time went by so quickly. I will continue to listen to your podcast. I want others to. I will encourage that. I want to hear more from Visionaries. And I think you're doing a great job. Please keep it up. I love your style. I love your approach. And I love the way you do it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited that we both came out of our cotillion this year,
Yes.
And, I think discipline is something that is like a vitamin that you might not wanna take it, but it's essential for so many aspects of our life. And I think what you're doing is really inspiring in helping, whether you're a entrepreneur or student or a stay-at-home parent, um, discipline is good.
I believe that as well. Self-discipline, any and in any form, is good, and try to move it into places where there's a priority. I think it would make everybody better. Just my humble opinion. Donna Loughlin, thank you so much for your time. You be well. I hope one day to get out to the coast, we can have a cup of coffee together and talk face to face.
Oh, we'll go for a flight.
Yes, we'll go for a flight. Oh my goodness, that would
Well,
be
that'd be
great.
fun. We'll fly someplace for it. We'll go get a $100 cup of
That's
coffee.
right. Yeah, $100 burger, right? And thank you so
Awesome.
much for your time. You be well.
Thank you. You too. Thanks so much, sir. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pin's Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Would you like to financially support the podcast? You can go to our Patreon site. Consider $5, $10, or $20 a month. There's all kind of plans that we have there. There's like a one-time payment. What is this podcast episode worth to you? $25, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, $5,000. You be the judge. You can go to our PayPal account to do that as well. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pin's Discipline Conversations.